terrorists calling to attack Americans around the world. And in this case, I think, in contrast to previous cases, there is very little doubt that there will be some form of military retaliation. What form it will take and when it might happen, I think it's much too early to tell, but I think it is all but inevitable.
David Martin, two questions. The last quote we had from any official at the Pentagon was that 100 people were believed killed or injured. Any later information about that?
The only number I've heard, Dan, which is 20 dead, but no one expected it to end there. The services that had offices in that part of the building have asked all of the people assigned there to call in so they know who made it out. And there are still, among all the services, hundreds of unaccounted for, but you don't know if that's because they didn't make it out or simply because they haven't called in. But if you just take a fully loaded commercial airliner, you know that the death toll is going to go much higher than 20, no matter who was caught in the building.
Well, that's a good point. And the belief is that American Flight 77, headed from Dulles Airport near Washington to Los Angeles, a Boeing 757. This is the plane that's believed to have crashed into the Pentagon, had 58 passengers and 6 crew. And while one might hope and pray that somebody among those 58 passengers, 6 crew survived, it seems highly unlikely. So there, right there, you would have, you know, in the 60s, the number of people dead, killed at the Pentagon. And the wife of U.S. Solicitor General Theodore Olson was aboard the jetliner that crashed into the Pentagon. She called him as the plane was being hijacked. She twice called her husband and described some details of the hijacking, including, now this is Barbara Olson, an attorney, very intelligent woman, the wife of the U.S. Solicitor General, the new one, Theodore Olson. She said that the attackers were using knife-like instruments. When she called her husband, she said the attackers, this is on the plane, that would have been the American Airlines Flight 77. She said that the attackers were using knife-like instruments. Now, the officials who quoted this conversation to the woman's husband declined to give any further details of the conversation. In a brief telephone interview from his home, Theodore Olson said his wife was on the plane and that that crashed in the Pentagon, and he said, I wish it wasn't so, but it is. Olson argues President Bush's case is before the Supreme Court. We're going to go back to David Martin at the Pentagon. David, I understand you have some additional information or insight, and then I have an additional question for you, please.
You were talking about the plane that crashed into the Pentagon. Someone made the point to me that all of these planes were cross-country flights that had just taken off, meaning they were all carrying full loads of fuel, which would obviously increase the destruction that they caused when they crashed into a building. Whether that was part of the plan or whether it just worked out that way, we of course don't know, but it would certainly indicate, at least initially, that considerable thought and planning went into this attack.
Indeed, David, including that they hit the World Trade Center at the height of morning rush hour, right at 9 o'clock. First one building, then the other, right at the very height of rush hour here in New York City. David, stand by because I have some questions about possible U.S. responses. You say, you know, the U.S. will respond. The how and why of that I'd like to discuss with you. But first, we want to go through a sequence of pictures of what happened here in New York today at the World Trade Center, including 2 pieces of videotape that CBS News obtained exclusively, and we've shown only in the last half hour or so. So this sequence of events that will not necessarily be in order, but this to review for you and give you the latest picture information we have is the way it was this morning between 9 and 11 a.m. New York time, Eastern time. One plane has hit the upper tier, but watch the left-hand corner of your screen. The second World Trade Tower has not yet been hit. It's about 9 a.m. Here comes the plane, very high speed, cuts almost through the building. Great balls of fire, tremendous bellows of smoke. The voices you hear in the background, the people in the home or the place where these pictures were taken. So the second building was hit. Now, you note the plane went in at about, that aircraft hit that tower at floor about 71. The first building was hit, 90 or above, say. So both buildings are now smoke and flame. Now, different view. Both buildings are aflame. And then the building that was hit second comes tumbling down. That was the one where the airplane came in particularly quickly and hit the building at about floor 71. The Chrysler building in the background. Now the second tower, which was actually hit first by American Flight 11, begins to crumble. And disappeared. And since then, the most recent collapse, which happened just a short while ago, Building 7, a 47-story building as part of the World Trade Center complex, collapsed. That building had been, we were told, completely evacuated. But the fate of people on the ground, including rescue workers, as it came tumbling down, we simply don't know. But it had been threatening to collapse, had been on the verge of collapse for a long while, so perhaps most of the area had been evacuated. But who could have anticipated this kind of incredibly dense and fast-moving smoke, which covers many blocks in New York? And like some white monster, came quickly down side streets and major thoroughfares. Now stay with me here. Stay with us here. CBS. This is another. See the plane? This is another view. More videotape.
Into the South Tower.
This plane.
Against a backdrop of gentle blue sky, a terrorist arrow pierces the heart of a city and a nation.
Oh. Those two sequences we should see again.
One more horrifying than the next.
And we will show you.
This was a United Airlines flight 175.
Some of this video has just now become available. And in the aftermath, well, if you've been with us, you know what happens. We're going to try to re-rack up. That's the opposite side of the second tower hit. You know, we had different views during the day, but this was photographed from that side of the building. Now, we're going to recue that sequence of videotape. This includes new videotape material obtained by CBS News over the last hour and a half. We have shown some of it. Now, this is the latest new video we have. You see the plane coming in high speed, aiming for the mid-level, and hits it.
Pierces the heart of a city and a nation.
That was the second flight, United Flight 175, and this is a reverse side of the building. See, the plane actually pierced the building.
There were several angles.
Virtually came out the other side.
Horrifying than the next.
Yet another view, the plane hitting.
175 out of Boston.
It's almost like the building swallowed the plane.
Yeah. Yes. And here you see this aircraft below. Did you see that? And to be looking closely on the right-hand side to see it hit in there. And indeed, Russ Mitchell said it's almost as if the building swallowed the plane and then belched back up. Well, nobody's ever seen photographs like that because nothing like this has ever happened before. We go to David Martin to Pentagon.
Dan, we were talking earlier about trying to give the appearance of a return to normalcy. Well, now we have one other appearance of normalcy, which is the fact that Defense Secretary Rumsfeld will give a briefing later this evening in the briefing room in the Pentagon. In other words, we're going to be allowed to go back into the Pentagon, and obviously, as that is designed in part to give a show that you can damage the Pentagon, but you can't sink it, that business continues in there as normal. Now, obviously, one of the pieces of business that's going to be continuing now is planning for some sort of military retaliation, although I think it's much too early for us to really have any good idea of what that might look like.
David Martin, we're going to go to Bob Orr, who has some new information in just a moment, but once in the Far East, an intelligence operative who was talking about revenge for things, terrorist events, used the quote, he said it was an old Oriental expression, revenge is best served cold, which the thought was that you don't want to enrage, lash out immediately. Now, given the fact, and it is a fact, that after the 1998 attacks on the U.S. embassies in East Africa, the United States government responded in fairly quickly with 2 separate cruise missile attacks, many missiles, at Sudan and Afghanistan. My question to you, David Martin, when you talk about some kind of retaliation is certain, what has been the thinking before this happened about the advisability of responding immediately or waiting and, in effect, serving revenge cold?
Well, they have 2 lines. One is that we will strike in a time and place of our choosing, and that supports the argument that you don't have to do something right away. But after those cruise missile attacks on the Sudan and Afghanistan, the argument was that that was not retaliation, that was preemption, because Osama bin Laden was planning further attacks against the U.S. and they had to disrupt his operations. So I can see that that argument would apply here as well. The U.S. could say it has intelligence that this was not all the attacks that were planned, that Osama bin Laden had further attacks planned and they had to act quickly to upset these plans. On the other hand, I can see them wanting to take their time and get it right so that we don't have another largely ineffectual strike as we did following the embassy bombings. The strikes did not get Osama bin Laden and obviously did not have any lasting impact on his operations, since he has been behind most of the threats that the U.S. has had to react to over the years. And of course, if the evidence indicates that he was behind this as well, then of course we really didn't do much to stop him with that earlier strike. And I think all that would argue for some very large military response, perhaps including going after him on the ground, which of course is always risky because of casualties. But I think the proportion of the offense, I mean, let's face it, this was the worst sneak attack on America since Pearl Harbor. And when you put it in that context, I think the American public would support taking casualties to go after the person who was behind that. But all that's still pretty far down the road, Dan.
Indeed. David Martin speaking live from the Pentagon. President Bush will address the nation tonight. CBS News will cover it live. We'll be staying on the air live. Very quickly, Russ Mitchell has some new information about attending to the wounded in New York.
That's right, Dan. The Health and Human Services Department has activated a national medical emergency system. This is an unprecedented move that will dispatch about 7,000 volunteer doctors, nurses, pharmacists, and other medical staff to areas affected by Tuesday's attacks, which of course would be New York and Washington. The timetable for this, Dan, I'm told, is immediately.
Russ Mitchell, 7,000 volunteer doctors sought from around the nation to come help in New York with what is a massive healing and tending to the dead and wounded operation, which will go on for weeks, if indeed not months. Now, Bob Orr in Washington has a new insight on this information from Barbara Olson, who was aboard one of the planes hijacked, about knife-wielding or knife-type instruments in the aircraft, and Orr's going to put that in perspective for you just at the top of the hour. Now, at the top of every hour and at the half-hour mark, we try to bring you up to date on the latest video we have, the latest pictures we have, the latest information that we have, and we'll be doing that just past the top of the hour on many of these CBS stations. The aircraft involved this morning, American Airlines Flight 11, Boston to Los Angeles.
It is a horrific scene, unprecedented in the history of our nation. Terror attacks carried out on several targets in the U.S., and dozens of New Englanders are among the victims.
Freedom itself was attacked this morning by a faceless coward, and freedom will be defended.
We have team coverage of the attacks and their aftermath on this special edition of WBZ4 News.
Good evening, I'm Joe Shortsleeve. Tonight, Americans are watching in horror at a series of events